Hello, and welcome to another episode of Theater XYZ, a podcast where people across generations will be talking about different issues facing the theater industry today. We're your hosts, Bailey Sheehan,
Elizabeth Miller,
and Matt Faragasso.
We'd like to welcome you to our show, but before we get started, we'd like to take this opportunity to respectfully acknowledge that we are hosting this podcast from the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape people, and we pay our respects to elders both past and present.
Part of the goal of this podcast is creating a space to learn and discuss, and knowing that as people, we can grow and our opinions can change. Nicole Brewer, an anti-oppressive theater educator and advocate, put it perfectly when she said the following during her workshop, Anti-Racist Theater, a foundational course. Recognize that we are both learning and unlearning, and while we are doing that, we are going to create harm. So giving ourselves the grace that allows ourselves to speak in draft, and knowing that that does not define who we are. That is not the last version of ourselves. This is really important towards forgiveness and building our shame resilience and being able to show up and do this work.
The guest on our show today is Madison Parotta, a freelance editor and dramaturg who is going to introduce herself in just a moment. And the topic we'll be discussing today is how we can make the industry more accessible to everyone, but particularly people with disabilities.
I also want to add quickly that we're getting insights from one very knowledgeable person, but there are 61 million people with disabilities living in the United States. And the opinions and perspectives we're sharing do not and cannot reflect the journey of every single person with disability. That being said, thank you so much for joining us, Madison. We're really grateful for your insights on the topic. Part of the podcast is trying to get the message out and educate people, including ourselves. We're not trying to shy away from any particular topics, but we're trying to find out what we know, what we don't know, and what we don't know that we don't know. And how we can be better about changing the theater industry. I have your bio here from the Theater Breaking Through Barriers website, but could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, your current occupation, and some of the companies you work with?
Sure. So I'm Madison Parotta. I consider myself a baby dramaturg, I guess. I'm an editor. I do some work in market research, and I'm trying to move to the world of publishing, specifically agenting. And some of the companies I work with is Theater Breaking Through Barriers, TBTV, The Theater Times, which is an online theater journal / magazine. I work with Includus Publishing, which is a publishing house specifically for people with disabilities. And I also work as a sensitivity reader for a company called Salt and Sage. Finally, I'm an intern, a literary intern at the Seymour Agency, which is a literary agency.
That's awesome. That's a lot of hats that you wear.
Wow.
You got a lot going on.
Yeah. I do, yeah. Yeah.
So I have a terminology question. Many articles use the term crip face, which, like blackface for Black people or yellow face for Asian people, red face, brown face, etc., is the term used when able-bodied people are cast in roles with a disability.
Mm-hmm.
I've also heard cripping up, disability drag, and cripicature. Is there a term that the disability justice movement in theater in particular prefers to use?
I really think it depends on the person. Personally, I just like to say, an able-bodied person is playing a disabled person. I think a close second would be cripping up. The word cripple is something that a lot of disabled people have sort of taken back from its earlier negative connotations. So it's kind of something that I would say that you're only going to want to let disabled people say that, not non-disabled people. And I just don't use it just because I don't know, I don't really have a reason, but I just prefer like the terms disabled and non-disabled rather than like able-bodied, because able-bodied suggests that someone who's not able-bodied is bad. So preferably my terms would be non-disabled and disabled.
Yeah, there's a lot of like terminology things that we didn't know and now we do know as we're trying to like learn how to navigate all
Yeah.
of this.
It's funny because I hear from a lot of disabled people, not just in theater, but in general, that a lot of them think they're alone until they start to get, like probably in their late teens, early 20s, and they start to realize that there's a whole community out there, and we're not necessarily in close proximity, and we can like reach out to each other via the internet. So, and a lot of people who are disabled have parents who are not disabled. So they don't know anything about that, and you kind of come into it as you get older. And some people don't come into it until they're much older. But either way, it's it's very fulfilling to know that there's a whole sort of group of people out there that identify the same as you. Yeah, and especially in like certain industries as well.
That's fantastic, and that leads me to I think the next question, which is it's COVID related, right? Do you find or do you think that a lot of doors that may have previously been shut to people who had disabilities because the institution would say, oh, we can't support that, or we're not accessible. Now with everybody working from home and having the ability and the flexibility of corporations saying, go do your work from home, that's okay. Do you think this is opening doors for people in situations that maybe it didn't prior?
It is, but it also isn't. Definitely, the remote working has been a huge help. Even personally, before COVID, I've been working remotely since like 2016, so that hasn't been a huge problem for me. But I know that um, just because something's remote doesn't mean they're going to see a disabled candidate and say, okay, this person's good for the job. Unfortunately, there's like I call it like gatekeeping. So there's people at the head of whatever it is, theater per se, at the top of the top, and they're not interested in bringing in someone who's disabled or really just a race other than white, even sometimes, most of the time. So those gatekeepers are sort of the people who are making it difficult for me and many other people to get a job in their respective field. Because I see a lot of diversity in like interns and entry level jobs. But when you get to the top of the chain, it seems like we haven't made it that far yet to have those types of people at the top. And I think once we do, they'll open those gates per se, and we'll be able to get a little bit more disabled people in the door, as well as other kinds of people. But yeah, those gatekeepers are the thing that seems to be holding lots of people back with COVID. Um, and I know in theater right now it's kind of hard to be like, oh, remote work, because you can't put on a show remotely, as you guys know, which is why I'm doing this podcast. So um, yeah, so I know that's sort of a difficult thing to kind of give a solid answer to now. But I know before COVID, like I felt like those gatekeepers were there, and they didn't want to work with me to sort of change things from this ideal scenario or utopia that they were seeing. They just wanted things to go on as it was. So that's an issue, obviously.
So to us, and correct us if we're wrong, the biggest problems we're seeing is the exclusion of people with disabilities pretty much everywhere, but definitely in the theater industry. And the only spaces where theater people who have disabilities are allowed to exist are spaces specifically carved out for them, such as theaters whose mission maybe surrounds disability, or when theaters cast a character that has a disability with a person who has the same disability instead of a non-disabled person. There doesn't seem to be a lot of people with disabilities being cast in roles where the character doesn't explicitly have a disability. Roles where ability is never mentioned or is relevant. However, there are able-bodied people being cast in roles where the character has a disability, which is another huge issue. Can you give us your thoughts on these problems?
Yeah, so obviously, like you said, they are problems. I've definitely seen a bit of a rise in disabled people being cast. That one, the version of the Glass Menagerie, I know they cast, I think it was Madison as Laura, who is disabled. So that was nice to see, certainly. I think the biggest problem that you mentioned was when a character's, I guess, lack of disability or disability isn't mentioned at all, so you don't know if they're disabled or non-disabled. I think disabled people need to be in those roles specifically because I see a lot of examples of plays and characters where a character is disabled and they cast a disabled person, but then their role is only about their disability. Like it does nothing to further the piece or anything like that. Or it might, but you know, they're disabled. That's their character. That's it. Like there's nothing to unpack there for the actor. And there should be obviously. And I think that having disabled people play roles that are meant for non-disabled people is like the next step that theater has to take. And they might not be even great at putting disabled people in disabled roles, but I think adding that on is going to help because it's important to see disabled people in regular roles because we're in regular life, we're regular people who do all sorts of things. We're not, our only thing isn't that we're disabled and we say, ouch, my leg every once in a while or something. Like we have stuff to do, like we have to work and make a living and deal with family life and all that. And yeah, our disability might be a big part of that. And that's something that might take up a lot of our day, depending on your disability, obviously. So it's important to show that too, but that doesn't have to be part of the equation. I know the one theater I work with, Theater Breaking Through Barriers, they're one of those companies that are specifically made up of disabled people or disabled actors and technicians and whatnot. And they're very small. They're technically off Broadway, technically, but there's not. They don't have enough funding. No one to give them funding, of course. So it's kind of like back to that gatekeeping idea. They're kind of kept in this one spot, and they can't expand because we don't have the means to. But without the means, they can't expand. So, and they're one of those companies that has disabled writers writing disabled people and non-disabled people, and disabled people play all the roles, whether they're meant to be disabled or not. Sorry, I feel like I'm saying disabled so much. But yeah, it's that's really something that needs to happen in terms of like acting to put those people in those roles, whether they're meant for them or not.
You talk in your one article, Disabled Bodies in American Theater, which is in the Theater Times, about inspiration porn, which I loved. And, you know, how we view people with disabilities as like these magical unicorns who are only there to like inspire and be brave and courageous by like going about their day-to-day activities.
Yeah.
Do you think that most plays or musicals that feature a character with a disability is inspiration porn? Do you think there's that many roles of a character specifically that has a disability that are like a true to life testament to like what your normal life is like?
Yeah, I don't know of many mainstream ones, honestly, that are that actually do it correctly, and I think a lot of that has to do with who's writing it. I don't know if you know about the Unvoices hashtag is a big thing that's been on Twitter in the past couple of years. And but it basically means like if you're writing something, it should be from your perspective. You can't write a story about someone who's black, and if you're white, like it doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. Like you don't have that lived experience, so you're not going to do it right. And there's plenty of people who have that lived experience who want to write about it, who should be given the opportunity to. Um, so I think of it sort of like that. And inspiration porn is a term by Stella Young, who was a disability activist. I believe she passed away recently. unfortunately. She has an awesome TED Talk about inspiration porn, so you should check that out if you haven't listened to it. It's quite funny. Yeah, I think that inspiration porn is definitely an issue. I feel like it's starting to go away though in certain aspects, and I feel like there's unfortunately some worse sort of stereotypes that are being put out there. Mostly as like disabled people as villains. So in a lot of like action movies, a lot of villains are disabled or have disabilities. Um, it's one of the big ones. And then just like general sort of dehumanization of disabled people who are unable to, like with the end of life bill, I think that was passed or wasn't passed, I can't quite remember. But a lot of disabled people saw that as harmful because it was something that would allow their caretakers to basically be done with them because they didn't want to take care of them or thought they were a burden. And it's not something we as a disabled community actually want for ourselves. It's more something non-disabled people want for us. So that's something that's really, really harmful. And yeah, like I said, these stereotypes are pretty dangerous for us because they lead to a dehumanization and things like the end of life medicine, and also the CRISPR thing that just she won the Nobel Prize for. That's something else that's quite harmful that comes from these stereotypes. So it's the idea that we can just be obliterated before we're even born and our genes can be changed is so harmful because like that's like the loss of a whole community and a whole culture. Not to mention the fact that disabled people obviously deserve to be alive and to live their lives just as much as someone who's not disabled would. But I don't feel like a lot of people know this because they might not have a disabled person in their lives, or if they do, they reduce them to the inspiration porn or some other stereotype. So they don't know anything about that until they actually like sit down with them and say, "Hey, so you're an actual person. Tell me about you." So that was a long-winded rant on inspiration porn, but that's what I think about when I think about that. And certainly in plays, it's definitely a big character trope, which is unfortunately very old and very harmful.
I feel like a lot of these taboos and people have this like fear of people with disabilities and like they feel uncomfortable talking about it. During our research, I found out about Sins Invalid, that it's a disability justice performance group that focuses on LGBTQ and gender variant people and like deals with sexuality. Because I know in one of your articles you mentioned also that a lot of people think people with disabilities are all asexual
Mm-hmm.
and don't have these same lived experiences. So yeah, I mean, obviously, like just opening lines of communication is key to all kindness and compassion and moving forward and progressing in the world. But I just thought that was interesting that there's a whole company devoted to like themes of sexuality and the disability movement.
I know one of the, I guess, directors of it, but I don't really know much about them in general. But I actually wrote an article not on the Theater Times. There's a website called Scarlet Teen, which is sex ed for like young adults and teenagers. I wrote an article about that. So if you guys wanted to check that out, you totally could. Yeah, and I just talked about how, just again, that myth of like all disabled people are asexual is harmful, and I also just talked about dealing with that in terms of like caregivers because if depending on like the severity of your disability, you need caregivers, and that means that your life is not private. No part of it is private. Especially if you need like 24/7 care or something like that. So I think it's important to talk about how you can have like, I guess, a good sex life without with caregivers who are helping you if need be, which can cross a lot of lines to some people. But I know a lot of people who can do that. And it also raises awareness too, like the whole asexual thing. A lot of people believe that. And it's just like, what gives you that sense just because I can't move my arms and my legs like you can, doesn't mean that I'm like lacking in any sort of other part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
I went to high school at a local Catholic school. We were asked to do community service over our 4 years. And one of the things I did was I volunteered at a local camp. It was called Camelot House for Children. It does a lot of work with terminally ill or disabled kids, young kids. And that was one of the things I talked to a lot of the moms about. These are young teenagers going through all these normal teenage things, hormones and emotions. And it's almost like, what do we expect them not to go through puberty? Like, right?
Yeah.
Even a young age for me, like, 16, 17, 18, having these conversations with moms was eye-opening for me at the time. They're only a few years younger than me. They're having all these things happen to them. And it's just like, why do we think that doesn't happen? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
I talked about in my articles, like there's a social model of disability and a medical model of disability. The medical model is I think something that most non-disabled people adhere to. It's just that if you're disabled, you have a problem and you need it to be fixed. But the societal model, I guess, talks about how society causes disability in an ideological way, because it adheres to the needs of people who are non-disabled and then ignores people who are disabled. So like the term special needs, I don't like using that term. I don't think that's a good term. It's outdated. Because someone's needs aren't necessarily special. Like they're just needs, just like everyone else's needs. They're just different, and they're not what people are used to. So yeah, that kind of goes back to that, I guess. So again, just back to those stereotypes and how they can be dangerous. But I think using that medical model, that goes back to the whole asexuality issue. It's just people don't see disabled people as 100% human sometimes, I guess. I mean, that's a rough way of putting it, but I think it's true, and that's why they say, oh, they can't have a normal life where they live by themselves or have a partner, they can't get married, have kids, can't have a job. That's just not true because they're looking at it medically. And if you look at it through the other lens, then you can definitely see how we're the same.
I think something in one of the articles you wrote as well, Disabled Bodies in American Theater, where you address, I forget your terminology, right, but how we're like almost sex phobic, right? Like in the regular world, like we don't talk about it. It all happens behind closed doors, except like on TV, right? It's just, it's so explicit on TV, but on TV, it's always between two white, heterosexual, very unrealistic. The model that we do throw all over our media are just these totally unrealistic models to begin with, but then everything else cannot be talked about. Yeah. And that really resonated with me in that article. So I wanted to just bring that up.
Yeah, and like seeing that can be harmful too, because if you're like, I don't know, 12, 13, 14, and the only people that you see engaging in like sexual acts are white heterosexual people who aren't disabled, you're going to start to think that. You're going to start to think like, oh, I'm disabled, so I can't do any of that. And that's that bias, sort of, can't think of the word right now, of course, but yeah, that's definitely harmful because tons of kids feel that way until they get older and sort of are integrated into the community and realize that, hey, that's not like the entire world, that's like 1% of it. So
it's also interesting from like a non-disabled viewpoint that if that's what you see is, white heteronormative people, I feel like a lot of times when people do think about sexuality for disabled people, it is like this weird fascination of like, how do you do it in like this really rude way, because they literally have only been shown one way. So the fact that like, I mean, you shouldn't be imagining other people's sex lives, but like, like I feel like that's the only way sexuality in terms of disabled people comes up, is like the logistics of how which is like so awful to ask. I follow Shane and Hannah, Laughing at My Nightmare.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they get questions all the time on their YouTube about like, well, how do you two have sex? How do you do this? And they're like, why do you keep like, why are you so obsessed with our body parts? It's weird.
Yeah, I do not want to know how many times I've been asked that. So,
way too many, I'm sure.
Yeah, way too many.
Well, it was really interesting. We were watching Crip Camp with my two young daughters. I have a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old. At one point, it swung past one of the images of one of the young men in the camp, and he had like long, shaggy hair and it was across his face. And she looked at him and she was like, "Oh my gosh, he's emo!" And I was just like, yeah, they're just teenagers. It's not impossible to think that exists. They're teenagers just like you. And they were just kind of like, wow, well, I mean, that's probably just from the whole like teenage experience as well. Like, nobody else is like us. We're teenagers.
Yeah.
We're so individuals.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like even taking that back, actually, sort of when I show people like what I've done in my professional life and like my resume, and I know it comes from a good place from you guys, but I'll show it to other people for whatever reason. They'll be like, "Oh my God, you've done so much. How do you do it all?" I'm like, I really don't feel like I have. I feel like I'm just saying that because I'm disabled and they think that I don't get up out of bed without crying all day or something. I don't know. But like, yeah, that kind of goes back to that sort of coping and not believing that there are people who can do certain things that you're used to.
Yeah, I think it probably goes back to us deciding. We decide in our mind, our perspective tells us, informs our bias, informs our opinion about whatever we're looking at. And if we don't have the information to set that perspective in a responsible space, it can be really, really detrimental and harming. And also, I think tying into that is a lot of us just taking everything for granted. Bailey, as we were talking about this and approaching today, that idea of I can be fine today, but tomorrow I might find myself exactly where a disabled individual is, and not really ever thinking about that, right? Because we take that all for granted, which I think is a monumental part of the issue. So, yeah.
And with COVID, I feel like that's much more prevalent because people are getting it, and then 2 weeks later they're suddenly disabled, and their healthcare is not great, and they have a lot of problems, and that's going to be probably a lot more people as things get worse now, until we have a vaccine. But those people are going to be disabled for life, and they're kind of been indoctrinated to the club, I guess, yay. But also not, yay, obviously. But yeah, so I think that's something we're going to start to see more too.
Do you think, or have you seen directors having a fear or try to avoid logistic questions or concerns, or maybe it's just uncomfortable for them to even approach a disabled person about their needs if they were to be cast, so they just ignore the whole thing altogether and are like, instead of having this awkward conversation with someone, I'm just not going to cast them and that's the end of that, as opposed to, God forbid, have a conversation with someone about how we can do this together?
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation. I think it happens a lot in audition rooms that those thoughts go through their head, like maybe someone disabled comes in and auditions for a role, and maybe they like the person, but in talking with the other collaborators at the table, they're like, "Oh, I don't know how to deal with that. They're disabled, so no." Or sometimes I just think honestly they don't even think about it. That's probably been my experience. I do want to share. I had a really good experience when I was in college with a director I worked with. I was dramaturg in a show that he had adapted. I was helping him sort of not write it. It was mostly written, but the order was kind of messed up, so we needed to fix the order. And I was so impressed because I didn't have a personal care assistant with me at the time. Usually I do, but at that point in my life, I didn't feel like I needed someone with me at that time. So he was like, "Okay, here are the note cards of the scenes." He's like, "Let me know where you want me to put them so that you can order them correctly." And then that was it. That was all he had to do, and I was so. It sucks to say that I was amazed because I shouldn't be. It should be a common occurrence. But I was amazed that that's all he had to do, and everything worked out fine. And it wasn't even a conversation. It was like a 5 second, how can I help you if you need help? That's a big thing. And I think a lot of I mean I haven't worked with tons of directors, so I don't know how they think about disability in general. But I mean I'm sure they're just like most able-bodied people thinking about it. But I do feel like a lot of people try to overhelp sometimes. So like if you're, for example, if you're going slow in your wheelchair, maybe someone might try to be like, "Oh, let me help push you," and that's so that's so harmful. For more than one reason, like I don't want anyone touching my wheelchair. Like people lean on my wheelchair sometimes, and I'm like, "Please stop! Like this is me. Like would you just randomly touch me on the shoulder while you're walking? No." So don't do that to my wheelchair. So yeah, that over like helping without even asking, that's so harmful. And I feel like a lot of people in theater and outside of theater do that, and it's just because they don't know. Like I feel like that should be something that's like in a contract really to be like, hey, if you're working with disabled people, have some common decency and just treat them like everyone else. And if they need help, they'll ask you. And if you really, really feel the need to ask them if they need help, go ahead, but respect their decision if they say no. And also, I guess I'm just skipping around here, but I mean, so many theaters are so inaccessible in general. Like, when any theater I've worked in, there's always steps somewhere. There's always some place in the actual physical space that I can't get to, which is frankly horrible and very annoying. So if I was like directing a show and I wanted to see it from the middle of the 8th row, I can't because I can't get up there. I can only be really close to the stage or way above it. So that's another sort of theater pet peeve of mine, I guess you could say.
So I'm like super interested in deaf theater. I took a lot of sign language classes when I was in college, and kind of going on to like making theater, the building itself, more accessible. I was really interested in designing for deaf theater. I saw a production by the New York Deaf Theater Company of Jekyll and Hyde, and the whole time I was having all these like epiphany moments of like, oh, right, the actors have to be constantly facing each other because that's how deaf people communicate. You can't be shouting at someone's back or they wouldn't be able to hear you. Or there's a doorbell ringing, but in the deaf community, there would have lights flashing in their homes. How do you translate that to the stage in a period piece? And they had like the street lamps on the stage flashed to designate to the deaf audience like what was happening. And I was like, wow, that's so smart. So I have some hesitation, and I don't know if I'm gatekeeping myself, but I didn't want to insert myself into a deaf space by like pursuing becoming a designer of deaf theater. And I also didn't want theaters to like know that I helped design for accessible productions and have them say, oh, well, this, this non-disabled person can do it. We don't need to train a disabled person to do it. So do you have any like thoughts or recommendations of how non-disabled people can contribute without taking opportunities away from disabled people?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is like for your example specifically, I think it would have been fine for you to participate in that, But I would say that you need to make sure you're like uplifting the actual people who are deaf. And like if there was a moment where there was an opportunity for someone who was actually deaf to, I guess, take on that position, I think it would be it makes sense for you to be like, okay, I'll move on to something else, because they have a lot fewer opportunities, I guess I would say, than you do. And I think that another big thing is just listening to people, and letting them have their say, and like active listening, not active listening, actually listening. Like, don't be thinking of what you're gonna say next. Like, just listen. Because I feel like a lot of people say they listen and they don't. And that's how a lot of these like bad policies and stuff get put into place, because they say, "Oh yeah, we're talking to disabled people," and they're talking to like one person out of who has one mental or physical disability, and there's like a whole plethora of us out there that you're not listening to. So what's the point even? Um, so yeah, definitely listening. And like I said before, just treat us as you would any other person. I guess that's like common sense, but I feel like a lot of people don't do that. And you know, I guess just give opportunities when you can, but I don't like it when people are like, oh, I need to meet my disability criteria, so I'm going to hire this one disabled person. And like they end up not being right for the job or whatever. And like it's because they're thinking of it in those terms. Like there's tons of disabled people who have experience and interest in this stuff, and there's tons who don't. So you kind of don't just do it for the sake of doing it. Do it because they're actually good at their job. And most of them are. Most of us have. I don't say this to brag, but I think a lot of us are more creative than a lot of non-disabled people, because we have to be creative in our normal lives. Like if you have to figure out how to put on a sock when you can't lift your foot up, you have to be creative, and that's like the tip of the iceberg. Um, so you have to be creative in your daily life. So obviously that merges over to your work, to your career life. Yeah, I think those are the big couple things. And just take us seriously, yeah, like I said before.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, I feel like I was like gatekeeping of course, instead of just asking people, I didn't want to offend anyone, so I just avoided it altogether, which is the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, and most people will want, like, if you ask, they'll be more than willing to talk. Like, it's much better than assuming something and moving on. Like, I always get people who are asking me, like, what's wrong with you? And it's kind of inappropriate. That question's kind of inappropriate for adults. If little kids ask me, it's like, whatever, they're little kids, they don't get it. But for adults, like, if you need to ask, like, ask. Don't say what's wrong with you. But just say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Is this comfortable with you? Etc. So I think asking is always better than not asking.
Okay, I have a question for the group. Do you remember the first time you saw someone with a visible disability on stage?
I feel like that doesn't happen very often. My first and only experience was I was in college. We had cast a woman in a wheelchair. The show was Mackinac, and she was the mother. She was fantastic, and the set was made with ramps. And then I remember there was a little bit of a heartbreak around the show. We got reviewed by the local newspaper. Whoever did the review said, oh, and what a great idea to put the mother in a wheelchair, and it spoke volumes. As it was, they totally interpreted it as like a
symbol,
a decision that we made,
a metaphor,
as opposed to like, oh, maybe this actress needs a wheelchair, right? And we were hurt for her and for us. She was part of the cast. Whoever wrote the article couldn't take the time to even maybe do some research or figure out what was going on. It was just like, what a great decision by the director. And it's like, no, it wasn't a decision. And I guess it's kind of all goes back to that we don't think about it a whole lot, right? And it's not always something that we address.
Yeah, I feel like for a lot of people, like Ali Stroker was the first wheelchair user anyone ever saw on stage, and the Deaf West version of Spring Awakening, which was fantastic. It was an amazing production, was a lot of I think the first time people ever saw maybe an interpreted performance or a performance with deaf and hard of hearing actors.
It kind of reminds me of the first episode of Glee. That one character who's in a wheelchair. I've only seen the first episode, so I don't know what happens past that. But this one scene when they're all in the theater looking at the stage from some vantage point, but I know there's steps there because I can see the steps. And like, how the hell did he hit his wheelchair up there? Like, it's so unrealistic. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't watch this anymore.
I think they also had a dream sequence where he gets out of the wheelchair as if he like can magically dance now, as if that was his dream this whole time. Like,
yeah, that's I hate that too, because that brings me back to current political landscape. That senator now, Madison, I can't remember his last name. He was in a wheelchair, and the president made him like stand up in the middle during his speech or whatever. I'm like, that's so ableist, because he's basically saying that standing up is like, oh, I'm so great now, I can stand up. Like, it's not that great standing up. And like, you don't need to stand up to show that you're worthy of like being a person with a career. But that's another conversation. And he's giving me that name, so I can't do it.
I was relating to Bailey and Matt earlier that the first visible disability I think I ever saw was with Marlee Matlin. Is that her name?
Yeah.
Matlin. When I saw her on The West Wing, who's and I think probably other movies that she was in. And I actually went to school with a woman who had a disability, and she was a fierce stage manager, who ran circles around the rest of us. So didn't prevent her from anything. I want to go back just a quick moment. There was something interesting that really struck me about when you were talking about how directors or other people, other individuals in a theater space might reach out and be helpful. That struck a chord with me because as a stage manager, it's intrinsic to my nature to be helpful to somebody else. And I sat back and I've been thinking about that, and I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure how I would address that, because it's sort of just my natural instinct to help you, whether you're, disabled or non-disabled. I think I would kind of reach out in that maternal, caretaking way to any individual. And I would hate for that to be perceived in a way that was untoward. And I don't know quite I don't know what to do with that.
Well, I think that's the difference. If you're treating everyone in this caring maternal way versus if you're singling out the person with a disability.
Yeah. And oftentimes, like, I know personally for me, I might look like I'm having trouble doing something, but I'm just doing it in my own way. And I don't necessarily need help. So I think if you're like talking about, bring, let's say the whole cast like a glass of water or something during a break, like that's a little bit different than like saying, oh, this disabled person has been trying for the past 2 minutes to pick something up off the floor, but they're getting closer to doing it. That's something I would kind of leave to them. And then, like I said, just asking works. Saying, hey, do you need help? If so, then you help them. If not, then move on. I think that's the best answer to a lot of questions about disability. When you don't know how to react in a situation, just ask. It's like, it makes us feel better when someone asks, because then we're like, oh, you actually care, and you're actually listening to me. That's great. So
yeah, it's a tricky balance for sure.
Yeah.
There's a whole rainbow of options for when it's right to ask. How many times, Bailey, Madison, have you been womaned, right? You've been like, oh, you can't lift that, you can't handle that because, you're a woman.
I can't lift it anyway.
Yeah. Right. So, yeah. Just ask.
Yeah, exactly.
Great advice. Thank you.
Yeah. Just something that I had wrote down before to talk about. I think I'm just thinking about accommodations, and that's sort of a big topic, especially in theater. And I know it's difficult in terms of money, but I think it's one of the things. I don't think I talked about this in the article. I talked about accommodations, but it's something I thought about the other day. Not only saying like, oh, how can I accommodate you better? But I feel like also having a budget for it is important. And I know people like don't want to hear that because like there's no money anyway to pass around. So, but I think that's something that's really important if you want to have some good disabled people on your team, to help create that financial incentive there. Um, yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking about that, and I thought that would fit in at some point.
I think you mentioned that too in one of your articles, right? Having a disabled dramaturg to be on the team is a very good way to start that conversation or start that process.
Yeah, especially if you're doing a show about disability or that involves disability. I get this in my work as a sensitivity reader as well. A lot of people don't know what they are, so but basically what I do is clients will send me a manuscript or parts of a manuscript if they're writing and a character has a disability for me to basically read and say, hey, this is good or this needs work to make it seem less ableist. And a lot of times, even people who are disabled will send that to me and I will read it and say, hey, you need to think about this because this sounds bad when you break it down. So yeah, just kind of a different sort of job comparison there. But it's always good to have someone, I guess, sensitivity look at whatever you're writing if it's something that you're not acutely familiar with. And that's why I say about the disabled dramaturg to have them because they know what it's like. And also you have to be careful because if you have a character that has autism, but you bring on a dramaturg who has MS, like that's not gonna really work. I mean, it'll help definitely, but I mean, I don't know as much about like the behavioral and cognitive disabilities or neurodiverse people as much as I know about physical impairment. Um, so, I mean, I've definitely been able to like spot things, and I definitely can spot things that are off, but I don't think I'd be as good at it as someone who actually has the lived experience with it.
We've been talking a lot about physical disabilities. Another part of that would be the mental side, neurodiversity, mental health, people with learning disabilities, cognitive or developmental, people on the autism scale spectrum. What do you think is the biggest challenge for people with these invisible disabilities to get involved, or what's a good way to help them, to bring them into the fold?
Yeah, like I said, I'm different than that, so I can't like I don't think I can give a great answer to that. It's like night and day, honestly. But I definitely think just the idea of an invisible disability can be hard to deal with, especially when people if you think people don't take not invisible disabled people, I guess that's the word, seriously. They really don't take people with an invisible disability seriously. Because they're like, oh, you picked that cup up. You don't have chronic pain. You're not disabled. So I think taking them seriously is the big first step. I see that a lot in media, theater, books, all the time. I think that's the biggest thing for people who are neurodiverse and who have invisible disabilities. Other than that, I'm going to say you have to ask them. You might want to. I know Mickey Rowe is a big proponent of that.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to him a couple times. He's great with that sort of stuff. And now they have their own theater company, so hopefully that will work out even with this pandemic.
Can I ask you a follow-up real quick on that?
Mm-hmm.
Because you have talked to Mickey Rowe, and apparently you said a number of times, something I read in one of the interviews is that for a while he didn't identify his autism, I believe, right, to
Mm-hmm.
the directors. He just went in and he did his thing, and then he was like, once I decided to be forthright with that, so maybe they would understand why I wasn't making eye contact. I got the impression that once he opened up about that with people, he was getting more roles and he was cast more regularly.
Mm-hmm.
I know you said it's night and day between physical and mental, but do you think, or has he ever alluded to the fact that maybe that's something that could even be helpful, like on an audition sheet, so they could identify that way, and then the director would know in the audition, wait, this is the situation. How do I adjust appropriately now knowing that information?
I think you can go both ways with that, honestly. For him, it's obviously easier. It could be easy for him to not disclose because he's higher on the spectrum. For someone who is not, it's impossible not to disclose because, like for me, if you look at me, you know, like there's no way. I think it depends on the person though of whether they're comfortable telling that or not. Yeah, I've been told so many conflicting things about this. I've been not interviewing, but been talking a lot with a lot of people who identify as disabled who work in the publishing industry, and some people have told me don't disclose it, never. Some people have said always disclose it. So I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like even with me, that's something I struggle with because if you're working remotely, you don't have to necessarily be like, oh, I'm disabled. But sometimes I like using that as part of my appeal, I guess, to say, hey, I'm disabled and I want to do this for disabled people, or I want to represent disabled authors, or I want to be a dramaturg on plays that are about disability or include disability. And honestly, I can't really say whether it works or doesn't. But I've heard from some people that they started off disclosing the disability and then stopped. And when they stopped, they got a ton more interviews than they ever did before, which is disappointing, honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have to like come out as a person with disabilities in order to get more allowances. Like that kind of feels really icky to me that you need to I don't know if anyone has watched the documentary Disclosure on Netflix, which is about trans people and how they frequently feel forced to like disclose their gender and sexuality before people can accept them, which I it's hard. Like I feel like, you know, we're all used to like different social norms. So, but I feel like, let me reset myself. I feel like you shouldn't have to disclose your ability status in order to have the same opportunities as everyone else. In a perfect world, obviously we're not there yet, which is awful, but I feel like in the ideal situation, people are celebrated for the different things they can bring to the table because, you know, you can't do a play that's all straight, cisgendered, able-bodied white people because that's not a reflection of the real world and it's going to feel hollow and it's going to feel like inauthentic. So I don't know. It is like, I feel like having an audition sheet, you know, like where people put their pronouns, like it might be helpful to have like, oh, here are accommodations I might need. Like I can't have strobe lights, you know, like those things I feel like are okay to disclose, but I don't feel like you should have to, I don't know. It just like, that doesn't, and again, I am a person that doesn't have disabilities, but it doesn't like sit right that I feel like I shouldn't have to walk into a room and be like, hi, I have anxiety and borderline personality disorder. Like, and that explains why I can be the way I am. Like, I feel like that shouldn't have to be a thing.
And then you have the whole issue of if you do disclose, people are the director might be like, yeah, no, never mind, right away without even giving it a chance. So it's really a double-edged sword. I don't have an answer, so I just know what I try to do.
How can we foster more disabled talent? In the We See You White American Theater document, they talk about how it's up to theaters to go and search out Black, Indigenous, people of color theater makers, training them, looking for them, not only to open the door, but to usher them in and get them into the rooms. They historically, that door has been shut to them. We're wondering, how do we start opening the door and escorting people with disabilities onto the stage?
I think the idea of going out and finding them isn't necessarily a bad idea, but I don't think it's necessary. I think maybe just opening the door will definitely help, and saying, hey, we're open to all diverse voices. Like, come audition for us, come uh, fill out this job application or whatever. Just like let them in, I guess. And then this kind of goes back to the whole gatekeeper point I brought up. It's the people that are at the top who have to ultimately make the final decision. They are the ones who need to like remove their biases and say, okay, let's do this. I know some people have said we need like to basically like dismantle the whole thing and start over, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think just leaving the door open, metaphorically, giving and saying, "Hey, we want these people," um, and they'll come to you. We're everywhere, and we're in all the channels looking for opportunities. So just give us a chance. And again, going back to the whole ask questions thing, I think that's a big one, especially for people who are more timid on the whole idea of just working with people with disabilities. Different people are going to have different needs, and you're going to have to find out what they are. And you won't even necessarily have to ask. A lot of people are very upfront with what they need. But that can also be another difficulty. Like I mentioned before, like if you don't have a budget for it, it might be hard to include them. But I feel like there's more than one way to skin a cat. You can usually they'll be able to figure something out if you can't, and working together with them is the best thing to do for that sort of problem. And also, I think like remote work again. I know we had talked about this. There's not a lot of remote work in theater, and I know that's not always plausible for every job, but for dramaturgs, I think it's totally plausible. I can totally sit here in my house and read the play and do research and then present it like with a Zoom, or jump on a Zoom with a director and say, hey, what do you think about this? It's totally doable. And I don't know why the gatekeepers are so unopen to it. Because that's a big thing for me, like travel. I can't really travel very much. I can't hop on a plane and go to the other side of the country just to work on a play for 3 weeks. Not going to happen. So I think that's really important, that opening up remote work when you can, when it's possible.
Thank you.
So we've been talking a little bit about disabled performers and technicians and stuff like that. So I do want to focus a little bit on audience and having that outreach. So you'd mentioned the financial aspect of it. So I've worked for several theaters that weren't at all accessible, from parking to lack of ramps to really small bathrooms. You couldn't even get into the building, let alone have a wheelchair accessible seat in the house. And I brought it up to them, and their argument was, oh, well, we don't have people with wheelchairs to come see our shows. And it's like, well, yeah, of course you don't. They can't even get into the building to begin with. Like, do you expect a horde of wheelchair users to start banging on the doors demanding a ramp before you consider building one?
Yeah.
Yeah. And people with disabilities have been advocating enough for themselves and for so long. Do you think the methods for getting audience members into the theater is similar to with disabilities is similar to how we're going to get company members and cast members? Is it a matter of opening the door? Do you think they just need a post on Facebook like, hey, everyone, built a wheelchair ramp. Hope you come see our show. Like, how do you, and you've mentioned difficulties with travel. So what do you think the best ways to bring people with, different disabilities, physical disabilities into the theater to begin with?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, making it accessible. I mean, if I can get in and I want to see the show, I'm gonna go. Um, but also, again, with the remoteness, I guess. I've been to a couple of like Zoom plays, which I really liked. It worked out well. Um, that was a good experience for people who had difficulty like leaving their house. And then going back to like, I know the neurodiverse population, that's probably going to be a different conversation for them. Just with sensory issues, I'm not quite sure how that would work besides having like the specific shows that are for people with sensory issues. But yeah, opening the door, and honestly, a lot of people who see shows are elderly sometimes, and a lot of them are disabled, whether you might know it or not. So you might technically have disabled people there that you don't know about. And I think things like programs and websites need to be made more accessible. Um, having having like an accessible website with like the contrast that you can change and the text that you can change. That's definitely helpful.
Didn't even think about any of that.
Yeah, there you go. And like Braille, because I know like bigger text programs too, because I feel like people don't understand that blind people can go to a show just because they can't see what's going on. Doesn't mean they can't go to a show. Like they can hear. And it's not just, and a lot of blind people aren't completely blind either, so they see a lot more than you would think. So with that goes in hand with the braille. Like you want to make sure you have that sort of accessible content for them. And like ushers helping people when needed. So that's a big thing. I know for me, it's certainly nice if there's an elevator, if there's someone's there to help me with the elevator. It's great. Yeah, except but the biggest one would be actual accessibility, an actual room, and having more than like 4 disabled seats would be good. Um, because every time I used to try to go see a show, I have to make sure that they have a handicapped seat, and when there's 4 of them, like they sell out so much quicker than a regular seat. So I have to be like months in advance trying to get my ticket. I can't go to like the half price thing, like the day of, like that never works for me. So I have to pay full price, which is rough if you're disabled and you are only allowed to make a certain amount of money so you can keep your benefits, so you can have people help you so you don't die. So
That's a thought process you don't think about. I mean, right? Like I never would have thought that.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember so Madison and I went to high school together, and I remember doing like dance recitals and everything with Stacy, who was our like director. She was a technical director, all that. And I remember there was a couple performances where there were more wheelchair users than seats, and I remember her being in this like frantic rush to be like, "Oh my god, we need to take seats out and we need to do it before they get here because that's so awkward for everyone." Like having a whole crowd watching you remove a seat so someone with a wheelchair could use it. I mean, like it just makes a unnecessary spectacle.
Yeah.
So I remember her being like really sensitive to that and making that like a priority of like, well, you can't fix it and you have to make sure that there's no one putting a stroller there or their bag or whatever may happen.
So I want to talk about a lot of what you already said, actually, but we're going to take a deeper dive, I think. Sensory friendly performances are scarce. We recently started doing them here at Zollner Arts Center, but it's typically only once or twice in a season.
Mm-hmm.
Interpreted performances are scarce. Captioned performances are scarce. The ways certain performances are staged can be difficult for certain people to follow. There are so many variables to plan for. Adjusted lighting, adjusted loudness. Should we designate an area of the house specifically to be disability friendly? How should we adjust blocking on stage to accommodate the folks with disabilities? Oftentimes, for instance, with interpreted performances, there may be seats reserved that are the best spot for people with disabilities to see from, but there are other times when this type of planning gets overlooked. I'm wondering, in addition to all the great stuff you just shared, which I wrote down a whole bunch of stuff, so thank you for that. With so many variables to consider, what do you recommend as the best approach for a theater or performing arts venue to take all of these factors into account so that nothing gets overlooked? Because hindsight is 2020, but in that moment we want to get it right. So how can we do that?
That's a big question. I don't know if I can fully answer it again. I think a big part of that might be looking at your population, who is in the surrounding area, who is coming to the theater. And I think going from there, figuring that out, I feel like it's really up to the individual theater. But in terms of like interpreters and captioning, I know it's, if you have the budget for it, have one that comes with the theater. Hire one for the whole season, and have maybe, depending on how many shows you do a week, maybe 1 or 2 times when they're at that performance, doing that. Because it's a great job for people who can do it. It's easy to learn if you're not ASL, obviously, but captioning is quite easy to learn and easy to implement. Besides financial things, obviously. Yeah, and like I said before, knowing your population, because like you could have like 10 people who have autism and no one who has a physical disability, or vice versa, or whatever. So it might not make sense for you to do all these things for someone with a physical disability when only people with autism are coming to your theater. But then again, you have like people who are traveling who want to come see something. But I think definitely, I say look at the ADA, but I also say don't, because it's not very inclusive. The ADA just says, hey, if your theater was built after this time period, you have to have a ramp, and that's it. And a lot of places will say, oh, the ADA says we don't have to because we're grandfathered in, which is horrible. But yeah, the population talking to those people, I think would be good. Again, asking them questions, and even doing like your own research online. There's tons of resources out there about disability and performance and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot that you can sort of take ideas from. Let's see what else.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it that I can think of right now. I'm sure I'll think of like 10 things after we end. But
we just have a couple ending thoughts and questions and about how we fix it. So I had a thought. It's not really a question. But Elizabeth kind of alluded to it earlier that being people with disabilities makes up the largest minority in the United States right now. And, I'm not going to wake up one day and suddenly be a Black person or an Asian person, but I absolutely could wake up one day and be a person with a disability, either through illness or injury or whatever. And if that did happen, like, would I lose my job that I currently have? Would the industry that I've given so much of my life to suddenly say, hey, can't make it work anymore, we need to replace you, sorry, instead of accommodating me? And I really hadn't thought about that until I started doing this research. And I wish that every single theater maker in every single theater thought about that. Like, if you woke up and suddenly had a disability, would your theater accommodate you? Could you see a single production in the theater you currently work in, let alone design in it, let alone act in it, let alone be a company member for? And if you do think your theater would accommodate you, would it be in the same capacity? Would they kind of just shuffle you off to the side? Would they decide for you what you can and can't do and like make you a pity project? These are all things like I never thought about. And after doing all this research, you know, I don't know how I would paint sets or build props as a person with a disability. And like, would my work replace me? Would they accommodate me? It's interesting to think about. It's a privilege, you know, that I definitely of all, you know, I think about my gender a lot and I think about my race a lot and I think about all the racial tensions in America, but like I didn't think about this and like I feel bad that I didn't think about that, but now I'm glad that I am doing research and learning more about it and what I can do, but it is interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think it depends on the profession as well. I feel like it's easier for people who become disabled to keep their jobs than people who are already disabled getting a job. Obviously, for your job, Billy, I'm not sure how they would do that. Like that's up to them and you, I guess. And obviously, it would depend what kind of disability you work with. But yeah, I think I would hope, obviously, that it would keep you on. Like there's definitely a way around everything, honestly. There's so many disabled people I know that paint with their mouth or their feet or whatever. Like there's usually if there's some way to do it, they will find it. We will find it. So hopefully that's a nice glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot today about some solutions to these problems. Some of them being like hiring playwrights with disabilities, hiring more people with disabilities in general, actors, dramaturgists with disabilities, casting them to in non-disabled specific roles and as love interests to break taboo with people of disabilities being these asexual characters. All things we've talked about. Can you offer any suggestions to a theater who, like, tomorrow wants to do something to become more accessible?
I think just opening the door. That's the best thing you can do. Like, if you open the door, people are going to find you. And it might not happen one day, but if you say, hey, we're looking for disabled people, come audition, come, put in a job application. And just opening that door, I think, is the biggest step. That's the first sort of thing that you can do, that you have to do, because otherwise you're not going to get anyone in if you don't open the door.
To follow that up, can you think of anything that would be a good long-term goal for a theater?
I think doing the research, like Billy was saying that she was doing some research, and then she had never thought about like what happens if she wakes up disabled tomorrow. I think that's definitely a good idea. And I'm sure there's a dramaturg out there who could like make a research packet to say, hey, you want to include disability? Here are the important articles that you should be reading that address certain issues. Here's how to sort of help eliminate your bias. So doing research, I think, is a good long-term goal.
I feel like a lot of times, too, when we're doing season selection for the plays that we're going to do, we try to take into account, do we have playwrights that are women? Do we have playwrights that are people of color? Do we have playwrights that are gender non-binary? But I don't know if we've ever asked the question if we had a playwright that was disabled. So that I think is a good question to add into like our list of things when we're picking a season of like, we're trying to represent a lot of people. Are we representing these people as well?
Yeah, so asking those questions definitely is very helpful. Like you said, I know you had mentioned Elizabeth about Crip Camp. That's a good place to start.
And I love what you say about in one of your articles that it's not about accommodation but inclusion. And we've been saying accommodation a lot, but it is about inclusion and making sure people are included and not just accommodated.
Yeah, they're not the same thing. There's diversity, inclusion, accommodations are all different things, and they're all like separate pieces worth looking at separately. You want to have diversity, but you have to make sure that it's not just one type of diversity. And once you get all those diversities in there, then technically you're doing some inclusion there. But then again, there's always like some piece of diversity that you could be working on. So there's always room for growth here, I think.
So we're getting close to wrapping this episode up very soon. Do you have any plays or playwrights that you recommend that are doing any great work out there that a theater might want to add to its season?
So I would recommend some of the playwrights from Theater Breaking Through Barriers. I don't have a list on me, but I know there's a lot of them. And I know if you go to their website, they have a list of all the people who work with them. So that's where I would definitely go first. Yeah, they do a lot over there. They do a lot of great stuff that's worth looking into and learning from and mentioning. So I would definitely start there. A lot of them are more shorter plays and one-act plays rather than full-act plays. So I would, that's where I would go.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being here with us. It was really informative and incredibly eye-opening. Any final thoughts or messages that you'd like to share with our audience?
You can follow me on Twitter. If you just search my name, I'm there. I talk a lot about disability there, more so on the publishing side. But there's I definitely try to follow a lot of people who are active in the disability rights community. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I feel like that's one of the first places to go. There's a lot of voices, and not just people who are white and disabled either, which is good. So yes, definitely look into that if you're interested. And just continue to do research and leave your mind open to possibilities that you never thought of before.
That's
Great.
awesome.
Thank you.
And audience members, we will link all those resources on our social media when we post this episode. So keep an eye out for that. Cool. So that was the episode. So now we're going to do our little outro.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
thank
Thank you so much.
That was
So much
fantastic.
knowledge.
That
Oh my
was-
gosh.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
wow. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you to Madison for being our special guest today. And thank you to the Lehigh University Department of Theater for sponsoring this podcast.
Our next show will be Sitting Ovation on December 16th, a podcast revealing who the interesting people who work in theater are, what they do, and why they do it.
And be sure to follow us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Facebook, and Instagram. Just search LU Theater. That's theater with an R-E, LU Theater podcast series. Catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.